A lot of the teams that I work with, the challenge is they work remotely. They can't build a culture because no one's in the same office. And these people are on, I call it calendar Tetris. They're on calls just all through the day. So no one has time or space to watch recordings, but they do the dishes, they go for walks, they drive the car and get stuck in traffic. So podcasting is the solution there.
All right, welcome back to another case study episode. I'm so excited today. We have Leanne Hughes. She is one of our OGs, author of the 2-Hour Workshop Blueprint. So excited to have you on today's show and learn more about how you're using private podcasts. Welcome.
I am an OG. I am a super fan. I talk about Hello Audio all the time, and it's so cool to be on a call with you, Nora and Lindsay. It's a delight.
We're excited to have you. We got a chance to preview and kind of look and see how you're using Hello Audio. So we've got you're using it one way that we haven't heard of anyone using it. So excited to reveal that in the conversation. But before we jump into the nitty gritty, I'd love for you to share a little bit more about your business and your business model. It just kind of helps people understand what your business looks like and then maybe how you are using private podcasts or how you decided to use it inside that business model.
Yeah, absolutely. So my primary audience are B2B. So I work with teams, organizations that wanted to get the best out of their people. And I sort of then have a B2C audience where I share what am I doing internally with businesses. And this started off the back of a podcast called First Time Facilitator. I was working for a global company and my boss just sent me around the world running leadership training and I had no idea how to do it. So I started a podcast in 2018 interviewing great workshop hosts, and then through those conversations just ended up developing a lot and now wrote a book on it. So that's basically a nutshell of the journey. But yeah, every day just new challenges with businesses just relating to leadership, team development, getting the best out of their culture.
I love it. So I'm curious, how did you get introduced to the concept of private podcasts? Because that isn't really mainstream in a lot of corporations.
That's why I love it because it isn't mainstream. So when you come into a business and you share this, they're like, wow, it's like an X factor idea. It positions you as like someone that's cutting edge, even though it's been around and I've been doing it for about 4 years now. I actually heard about it through Jenny Blake, who's one of my mentors in New York City. She has a book called Pivot. I'm part of her private community. And as I'm based in Australia, I could never make her calls that were on at 2 p.m. Eastern time. And so she would throw the calls on a private podcast. I'd tune in and I thought, within a few hours of the call, I was at the dog park listening in and going, this is the best way to consume content. So that's how it started for me. And then I started thinking, how could I use this for organizations? Because a lot of the teams that I work with, the challenge is they work remotely. They can't build a culture because no one's in the same office. And these people are I call it calendar Tetris. They're on calls just all through the day. So no one has time or space to watch recordings, but they do the dishes, they go for walks, they drive the car and get stuck in traffic. So podcasting is the solution there.
Oh, I love it. And calendar Tetris speaks to me. I remember my time in corporate. Yes, that's very accurate. Calendar Tetris. Okay, so I'm curious, when you first started looking at introducing private podcasts into your business, what did you start with? What was the first thing where you're like, all right, I'm going to try it and test it out here?
Yeah, so the very first thing was actually for B2C, and that was my booked out facilitator program. And it came from more of a selfish need. And I'm sure many of your clients have said this, like, I just didn't want to get on video. I just did not want to get on video.
Love that. Yeah.
So I was like, and I launched this course and every week I'd promise content. And I was like, all right, I need to get the content done. So the low friction way of me, I mean, I've done over 250 public podcasts now in terms of episodes. So it was very easy for me just to talk through the content. I think out loud, using the audio as transcripts, repurposing for workbooks. So that was a sort of foray, was like experiment in B2C. The first B2B gig came out when I was hosting a conference for a tech company in Brisbane, Australia. And they were flying in their team from around Australia for the conference. And I said to them, it was all about connection and storytelling, really creating an amazing experience on the day. But I was like, what if you get a new team member that starts next week? They're going to miss out on this. So how do we capture this experience and how do we scale it, right? And so that's when the private podcast came up for them. And I included it as an option 3 in my proposal and charged $20K extra for that. And they said yes.
Oh my goodness. Okay, tell me more about this, because I've never heard, the way I think you described it is you kind of help these companies go on like a listening tour and you're interviewing employees, which, having worked for Fortune 500 big companies that are geographically distributed, this this is brilliant to build culture. So I want you to share a little bit more. And then if you could share maybe some of the results that these companies have seen, because for those of you listening, this is huge for a lot of companies.
It's huge. And thank you for sort of understanding exactly, because a lot of companies do onboarding and we know what it's like. There's all these memes out there. You're just clicking through the onboarding video and it's all about policy and safety and evacuations. And like they talk about culture, but you don't really understand it. Whereas, so what we did with this company, and I've got different scenarios for different organizations, was we're like, let's just get the stories of how people work. How do they work remotely? What's their morning routine? How do they connect with people even though they're not physically there? I interviewed some leaders around topics around well-being, leadership styles, who inspires them, but also questions that really, you connect with people. Like, what's your favorite song if you could have dinner with 3 people? And these are the conversations that you typically would have if you were walking past someone, or those water cooler chats. But because podcasting allows for the long form media, it's just a tremendous way of doing that. A more recent example that I've shared is going on a listening tour. So I've been hired by a department within, again, a big global business, and they're looking at how they build their reputation within the business, what services that they offer. And so they basically got me to connect with some of their general managers, their key stakeholders in the business. And we did 20-minute interviews with them. So set it up on Calendly like I would a normal podcast. They book in. I'm asking the questions around, what value does this team have? What potential do they have? And call that a listening tour. It's like market research, but more fun, right? A listening tour is more fun than that. And before I met up with this team for their first strategy day, I shared the podcast with them. And so that gave them insights on what was coming up. And I also got the transcripts from those and discovered what were the patterns that were emerging here and, whether that aligned with what the team was thinking as well. So that was a cool use case.
Fascinating. Oh my goodness. And I mean, if you think about anyone who's ever had a job anywhere and there's an employee handbook, oh my goodness. I don't know how many people, I'm sure not everyone reads it. They just kind of scroll the bottom and they sign their name and then we're done, right? Or maybe they keep it open a little while if they think.
They look at the things that matter to them.
The thing that matters. Maybe you keep it open a little while and you scroll a little bit once in a while so it looks like you're the time that you've spent on it because they're recording the time that they had the thing open and maybe you're, kind of gaming the system. But no one that doesn't do anything to share about what it feels like to work there. And to your point, we have company values as well, like every other company does. And we will actively talk about them. But when you have a big company and you don't get to connect with everyone and the founders of the company on a daily basis, they're just words a lot of times. And so I feel like what you're allowing is this company culture to really come to life and also allowing teams to work better and maybe even in a healthier way. So I think that's really cool. And I think it can extend to smaller teams as well. I think this is something that we could absolutely apply. If you're listening to this and you're like, all right, I'm not a huge company, but this is something that I think even entrepreneurial startups, when we're moving so fast, could benefit from as well.
Yeah, there comes a point in any type of business growth where you get over a certain number. You would have heard Dunbar's number of 150, right? But I agree with you, even just for smaller, even just to capture your own thoughts around as you're building a business, what your philosophies are, how that translates to what you've done that day. Just rolling commentary as you build. Because I think often it's like, oh, I've built this, now I've got to create the policies and systems and the culture, but you can do that as you build. And just to your point, it's more about, more than ever, we're hearing it's all about the connection and the human. That's blasted. We know this. So it's like, okay, well, how do you actually make that happen? And as you know, right, so people that listen to my podcast are just, when we meet, they're like, they know me really well. Like they know what type of coffee I have, my husband's name, all that sort of stuff. Weird interests. They know all of it because they've intimately connected with me through the power of audio. I agree. And I'm surprised not a lot more people are doing it, actually. It's still a surprise when I mention it to clients.
Yeah, that is interesting. And I've seen when we were kind of first starting, there was podcasting for work was like trying to be made a thing, and Clubhouse was, blowing up. And what's weird is, I don't know, part of it was somebody at Techstars, Nora, who was like, yeah, but I don't really want to listen to work stuff. Right. And so, but what you're flipping is you're saying, what makes humans human? Like, it's the storytelling piece. It's not the here's an announcement, you're getting, paid time off is increasing or whatever. It's more like, who are the people behind this company? it made me think, was it a different episode we did, Nora, where it was like, oh, we should like podcast decisions we're making in our company so we could just like have a record. And it's one of those things where it's the storytelling, the record keeping piece of it, that it's like you catch so much more in the voice of someone, the emotions, like their intentions, like exactly how they're feeling potentially towards something. So, do I sound a little nervous about these, goals that we're setting, or like, what were we feeling at the time when we're having this major issue come up? And it was like, oh, that would be really cool. Like historical stuff that even just the three of us co-founders, like we've been running pretty lean for a while. And it's just, that would just be fascinating for us as people to be able to look back on. I don't know. So I think there's something there. And yeah, I'm curious, like what even gave you this idea to do something like this? Because it does seem very unique.
Probably my obsession with podcasts, to be honest. And I think there's like a tool called Strengths Finder. My number one is like ideation. So just being able to connect different things. And I just saw it as a real problem, is that clients were constantly coming to me saying, we want to create a team culture, but we can't get people in the office. How do you do that? And the fact that I had built up relationships with people all around the world, I'd never met them in person. I'd collaborated on a project with a guy in the Netherlands, and we only used WhatsApp voice notes to make that happen, right? We didn't even use email. We just voice noted and used WhatsApp. And I thought, well, companies are still using like boring, just traditional media like emails, Microsoft Teams, and time zones are really challenging as well. Like having to jump on live calls, people staying up till 11 o'clock at night, jumping in early. There had to be a different solution, and so and I think it was like I just had the idea, and this proposal came out, and I thought, and I use my options. So I have 3 options. I've from the Alan Weiss School of Consulting talks about that. And option 3, I always just call it my wild card option. Like, this would be crazy if it came off. I have no idea how it's going to work, but let's just throw it in and cast the vision of what it might look like. And the first time I did it, yeah, they were sold, which was really surprising. And then I had to figure it out, right? But I'd done the B2C podcast first. So I knew the tech. It was more about how can I advise on the best way to do this? And it's always a partnership with clients. So you're like, okay, what is a value you really want to promote? Or who's a cool person that has an interesting story that we can share, right? So I'm just asking clever questions of the client, and they're finding the people, and then we're working on the approach.
Yeah, you're like a podcast interview that is like on demand or hired to document what the company's doing at a given time. That's like really cool.
Yeah, and I think where I'd like to take it, I mean, companies are lean as well. They don't have a person in there that's just available to do podcast interviews. But I think it's a real great development opportunity. And I'd love to just sort of help people with internally, like just help them do it, train them, provide the details, and they could run it themselves. Because the value of going on a listening tour is the fact that you're doing it, and that builds up buy-in, just the process of going on a listening tour. So it's more effective if someone internally in a team is doing it versus an external consultant.
That totally makes sense.
Yeah.
Talk about humanizing a company. Like that's just, and how important it is for younger generations. I would say even more important than it was for some of the older generations, for it to be more human in the story. So it's not just about the replay of the all hands call, which no one really cares about. But it's, I mean, some people might do, but it's the, the stories and really making it come alive. I'm curious, have any companies wanted you to interview customers, to share customer stories? Like, we have our customer success podcast, and that's it's a pretty popular private podcast for us because we're sharing stories about how people are using Hello Audio. But I would assume, like, I know when I worked for larger companies and I was more removed from direct client interactions, it was always fascinating to hear how our product or our service was changing their lives. I'm curious if other companies are interested in that too.
That is an amazing idea, and one I will start pitching now. Thank you, Nora. But I think for that listening tour I was on, that like their clients were the internal stakeholders. So it depends on the team that I'm working with. And I think I think that's a brilliant idea. It's like getting that perspective on how other people see you. And the value, I mean, Pat Flynn talks about it, of learning the lyrics, right? Just like hearing like really intimately what someone thinks about the business and how they've had their experience is great. So I think I'll definitely be using that for sure as another option.
Especially from the perspective, I used to teach that in my Build a Better Beta course, is like, you shouldn't maybe even interview people for testimonials, right? Because they're going to tell you, the creator, like, oh, I loved it, it was so good. But like some outside person coming in and asking, you get better stories. Probably even like better, not even critical feedback, but probably more in-depth instead of superficial, where someone feels like they have to be like, oh, I love what you created because you're talking to the person. It's like, oh, I actually really love this part. Or it just becomes more nuanced, I think, when they're not looking at the boss for various reasons why that would be scary, but an outside person too. So that's really cool.
Yeah, and I think the other, you just brought up a point that the value of this as well is often, companies often hire me because they want to build communication skills internally. So the value of being on a podcast and being a podcast guest is you have to nail your point. You got to, really think about what you're trying to land here, how you do that succinctly, how you storytell. It actually encapsulates all the things that make a great communicator by being a podcast guest. It's great for personal brand building internally as well. It's just win, 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 win. And the more you look at it.
Now, so obviously this has been really successful, and it just your wild card option sounds like it's been a pretty decent contributor to your revenue stream. I mean, you don't have to share numbers if you don't want to, but it sounds like it's pretty popular. So that's positive. What are some of the other ways you're using private podcasts in your business?
Yeah. I mean, you might have seen my private streams. I've got like quite a few. I'd say over 30 or 40 streams. I did a post about yeah. Well, I mean, a few favorite ways. I think, Lindsay, you've got one as well. Just a podcast stuff Leanne needs to listen back to. So back to the corporate work, because I think the most powerful episodes are where I jump on a scoping call with a business client and I'll ask, hey, can I just record this? It's not going to be shared anywhere. So as I'm asking questions to scope out the proposal, I don't have to take notes. I can be present and really listen, right? And that's important to stay open. And then I have that recorded. I'll go to the dog park, listen back and think about what they're actually saying. I get the lyrics and I make them like the options in the proposal. So I'm mirroring what they've told me right back to them. And that, honestly, I can turn around proposals within 24 hours now. And speed is most important, I reckon, in the game that we're in now.
Yep.
That's been really great. And then once I get the job and we're doing scoping calls, again, I'll record that. So I'm doing a strategy day for a legal firm. We jumped on Zoom last week. I've recorded it. I put it on the podcast. That strategy day is in about a month. Next week, I'll start shooting and going, okay, what do they actually need? And that gives me time to really design a great experience for them. Because often it's really amazing how we miss in the conversation because we're thinking about where do I go next? And we're not really. I know everyone tells us to be present. It's hard to do it 100% of the time. And you pull up different threads when you listen back. So that's the utility of it. Plus, I've worked with like really great coaches and mentors. So I record those conversations and listen to myself. And sometimes it can be quite embarrassing, but it's
right.
a growth
all
opportunity.
In the name of growth. All in the name of growth.
Yeah, that's it.
I like that idea of listening back to sales calls. There's probably some analysis you could do there too, whether it's a discovery, scoping, the like layer. And then there's the special piece of I don't have to do it on Zoom or I'm not just reading a transcript. You're actually, because now we have AI that does like outlines and points, and that's helpful too, way more helpful than what I used to do, which was probably not listen back. But you're bringing up a point. You're like, when I'm with the dog at the dog park, I'm listening. There is a different part of our brain that's working there. Like combined with an AI transcript and re-listening and feeling and catching stuff that you don't like. I think they're two different mediums that complement each other. And the idea that you would log into Zoom, be sitting at your computer, watch the recording is just like, that's just never going to happen. So you're getting work done in the space of time that you're also spending time outside and hanging out with your loved ones and your dogs and all the things. I love that. I don't think I thought about it in that way. My listen, Lindsay, are like, things I paid for typically. I guess I'm not in the service business anymore, but I used to be. So I'm like, oh yeah, that's a good point. Like I meet with somebody and they're sharing their deepest stuff. Then I take away whatever I probably already constructed in my head of what I expected them to say instead of taking a step back and listening again. So that's really special.
Yeah, I talk about falling in love with the process. And as you said, Lindsay, like I just hate sitting there and watching videos and having to write a proposal. And even, I don't do written proposals anymore. So I do Loom videos where I sort of capture these things and just speak in one take based off what they've said. And so it's quite organic. It's more fun for me. And that helps
that's
the
huge.
speed part. Yeah.
Yeah. Writing proposals is not fun. You're like, there's potential money there and that's awesome.
Yeah.
So you're like, that's the carrot, but the actually doing 100%.
Absolutely. And I think in terms of other feeds, I've had my book that came out earlier this year. I know you've probably shared this on your show, was like giving people that jumped in and bought it in the first week a free version of the audiobook. So it's much easier to facilitate that through Hello Audio than doing it through the back end of Amazon. I don't even know how to do that in Audible, actually. And even with clients now,
you have to go to a professional studio or something. They have like very strict rules too about how they do that, and they take a cut, right?
That's right. Yeah, that's it. And so when I do a 2-hour workshop for a corporate client, the 2-hour workshop based on my book, I can say, hey, I can give your employees a copy of the audiobook as an option to, again, and just charge extra for it.
Nice.
So yeah, I mean, there's so many possibilities. And what I love about like the work that you do and what I see on your Facebook group and on your show is just, it's just mind blowing how we can use this medium. It's my favorite thing in the world. So I'm just really grateful for both of you and Derek for creating this.
Aw, that means a lot.
Grateful for you. We're grateful for you. I mean, and
Exactly.
I think that's the coolest part is that we have users that have lots of different businesses, lots of different business models, and everyone has just amazingly unique ways that they've thought about using it. And I think, we have ideas, but learning from our community and seeing what everyone else is doing is probably one of the most fun parts of the week when people are like, oh, I just tried this. Or I'm like, it's the best. We have the best community ever.
Yeah.
So we really appreciate you and sharing what you've been sharing. This is also really fascinating for folks. I'm curious. Now, obviously, you're a podcaster. You're kind of a pro. This is something obsessed with podcasts. I get it. Sometimes when we have folks that aren't as tech savvy or not as familiar with podcasts, and they do get a little bit nervous about using this medium, this communication channel to communicate. And I'm curious in your experience with, your B2C and B2B, I'm sure you've interacted with folks that aren't, podcast listeners or avid podcast listeners. And I'm curious what you've done or how easy you found it to introduce that and any feedback you've gotten from folks where you're introducing a new medium to them.
Yeah, that's a really great question. We did a really fun launch for that first company that I worked with. And so we had the podcast available on Hello Audio, obviously through that medium, but also through their SharePoint site. So had to get both covered. And when we did launch it, we had this really great sort of flyer that was printed on, but they went old school, designed a flyer with a QR code. For those that were in the Brisbane office, they handed around the flyer and a Kit Kat. They said, have a break. Here's a QR code, download the podcast, listen to your colleagues. And it was really cute. Yeah. So I think like making sure it is on the traditional platforms where people can access, because you're right. Some people will be like, I don't want this on my work phone. And that's okay. We don't want to create additional barriers. So having it on the team site, they can do things like embed the media. So we cover that off that way.
I love it.
Give the options.
It's been a hot minute since I heard the word SharePoint. Wow.
Oh,
I know exactly. So why are we surprised that they are doing this unique and new thing? Maybe because it's been 30 plus years of,
Yeah.
Kudos to them, though. Kudos.
Yeah, for taking a chance on Leanne with her wild card package.
Well, you're right. I mean, and go with this all the time. Like, who am I actually? Do I want to work with these traditional companies? But they do. The pay is really good. Really.
Yeah.
But I think they are after, like, they do hire creative people. They're trying to find, They hire creative people, but the creative people internally are stuck within the process and can't really do anything. So you need that external person to come in and, there are amazing people within those businesses. It's just the structures that are, we all know.
Old.
That's right.
So I feel like you probably have a podcast, like a private podcast you're sitting on that you haven't launched yet, or like an idea. Is there a secret one that you're thinking of and just haven't executed yet?
Oh, every day. I have
you're like, here's the list.
Honestly, I have like 200 plus. I'm really obsessed with words and language and interesting titles. If you would ask me yesterday, something I'm playing around with is how people do high intensity interval training.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I've figured out I've got a HIP framework now. I call it high intensity interval performer, that describes how I run my work day. So yesterday it was a bit crazy and I was like, all right, I need to pause. Like, how you have that break. And so I just booked a massage within the couple of hours of calls. But I just work with a crazy intensity, then I pause and then go back. So that's something I'm riffing on and doing a bit of content around. And I think we're not robots. It's sort of like the anti-consistency message. Like we're just told, oh, be consistent. It's like, not me. And so I wanted to run a new narrative on that. So just plotting things on what that would look like. Yeah.
That's
super fun.
That's super cool. I'm curious so some of our listeners that are probably listening to this episode, they haven't had a chance to really dive in. They're like, I don't know, this might be too complicated. I don't know if my users are going to like it. So I'm curious what advice you would give someone who hasn't yet started or is new to this private and or public podcast space.
Yeah, I think I would just say it's taking that extra step. So in terms of what you're already doing already. So I'd imagine the people that are listening and that haven't started have been on a Zoom call and they've recorded the Zoom call. I think all private podcasting is just an additional step of taking that. In the really basic stages, just taking that medium and putting it into another context. That's all it is. So you're just uploading it to a new place, and with Hello Audio, you're just dragging and dropping. So it really isn't. That's where I'd start it, just from that baby step of, well, you're already doing this. You're hitting record. You're putting it on a Dropbox site. Why not just craft it in? I think the interesting thing about my podcast was around workshop facilitation, and my early episodes were very scripted and very sort of, here are the questions, and again, not very responsive. And I kind of get scared listening back to those. But the irony is that as I became a podcast host and released more episodes, my communication skills just developed rapidly as a result of being a podcast host. So it's not only the fact that, yes, you're building great relationships with people, but the internal journey of being a better communicator through your voice, the utility of that across any other, in your life, in your business is tremendous. So even if you don't get any listeners, the utility was I was learning a lot. I was becoming a better communicator. And so that would be my call to action. If anyone's sort of just thinking about it, is you just become a better person as a result of recording these interviews and getting on a show. Even if it's a solo podcast, right? Because you've got to think about structure and value as well.
I love that. Yeah, communication skills. And that's kind of what you had mentioned when companies hire you to also just improve communication skills overall. It does, even if you have a private podcast where you're the only one that is listening, to reduce the risk or reduce the fear or whatever. It does help to listen back and to, hear what other people would be hearing. So that's fascinating. I love that. Thank you for sharing that.
No worries. Do you find that, because I'm definitely a person where I think out loud, like a bit of an extrovert, just think through talking. So when I'm sort of playing around with an idea, I will just jump on a microphone and just hit record and just try to get that out. So often for idea refinement, like, what about your audience? Are they similar, or do you have a mix of people that are actually a bit more thoughtful?
We probably have a mix.
I'm like you. Yeah, I think we have a mix. I'm exactly like you. I need to talk through things. And there was a guest that was talking about using a feed in that way. I've personally not done that. But I'm like, I just like dump on Derek. He's the host of my ramblings. But listening back to stuff and helping yourself think through the like refinement part of it, I think is pretty powerful. So yeah, I would say most of our listeners are a mix, especially because I think, yes, extroverts are the ones people think of that have these like personalities and are social and stuff. But there's a lot of business owners that are very introverted. And there's something about running an online business that really fits that. And so my guess is that it's either very split or possibly even more introverts than extroverts, just because of the medium. And I think with businesses, most people are surprised to find out who's an introvert because they show up on social in a certain way, but they're not actually in a room with anybody else. It's just them. It's actually a very like introverted thing. So that was something that I had to learn as an extrovert. I'm like, isn't everyone just like me? But yeah, so I would say it's probably a decent mix.
Cool.
Yeah. I think when I used to do brainstorming, for me, it was the whiteboard. And so it was just me and the whiteboard, but I do talk out loud. I mean, I think growing up, you do think out loud, you process out loud. And for me, it was always like, okay, I've got to draw it out because now I need to sometimes visually see it. And I'm like, that's not right. And so it's interesting to have the medium to be able to easily record using a voice recorder app on your phone, which most phones have, right? And just kind of built in. And now how easy is it just to create content? I mean, whether, you capture an insight, you had an epiphany, or when I used to be a lot more of a reader before I had kids, but this, as I'm sure most parents are, but even just having an insight from a book and being able to quickly pick up your phone and do a quick voice recorder app and be able to share that with your audience or turn that into a social media post or something. I think that's a fascinating use case for this as well.
You've just prompted another thought, Nora. The other thing is, because I do speeches and often I have to sort of memorize certain elements of it. I don't know if you've heard this, but just like talking the speech out, recording it, then playing it back as I'm moving. That really then gets the speech like in your muscles. Have you read Jonah Berger's book, Contagious?
I haven't read it, but I think I do own it.
Yeah. So he talks about we're more likely to share something when we're in motion, when we're moving versus when we're sitting down. So that's why when I go running, I'm always like, I've got to share that with so-and-so, or I've heard this on a podcast. But even for like memory retention, it's just really powerful to like then take it on the go, listen to it in the car. So that's another way I've used the private podcast too. I think the longer we talk, the more use cases will come out. But yeah.
How many hours we got? No, just kidding. Super cool. Well, this has been really fascinating. A look back into Nora's past life as a corporate person. That's a world I never entered. But not that academia isn't some version of corporate. It's a different type of corporate, but definitely something that
for sure.
It's a version for sure. Its own unique version. But yeah, it's been really great to have you on to be able to share that side, because I do think that there are a lot of people in our audience that definitely serve this. Barbie Honeycutt is another thing I was thinking of. She serves academia, but that type of client, these old institutional kind of ways of doing things, this is like such a great disruptor. So if you're listening and you serve this audience, again, creating that wild card offer. I mean, Leanne just gave you a bunch of ideas, but also if you're a small business owner, think about some of the strategies she thought through and like, how can you add these types of things to your things? I'm even thinking through case studies and testimonials and having a feed. Like, you could be a consultant that offers that as a service and it becomes a podcast instead of having to be, it could also be a blog and all the things it can be, which actually is something that we didn't talk about. It was a thought I had when I was listening to you, is how repurposable that what you're creating for your, like that wild card thing that you created. There's a bunch of content in there for a corporate office to be able to do with it. You briefly highlighted that, like it's turned into different things. Yeah, that idea of the podcast being repurposable, can say that. Something you can repurpose, I think is really huge too. And so for somebody to pay you $20K to do it, they're actually seeing the ROI. There's like layers of that ROI. So anyways, random thought at the end of closing out of our episode, but good nonetheless. So we end with our favorite question, which is, if you had a private podcast of your life's ramblings, what would it be called?
I think I'd call it maybe Leanne's Long Lunch. And
that's cute.
Yeah. I'll just be, because my favorite thing is like just hanging out with people like by the water, drinking champagne, and you get really great conversations out of that too. So, and maybe reflecting on some of the great long lunches I've had as well. Yeah.
I like that.
I love that.
So we might have to book you for like several other of those feeds we went through. No, it's cool. That was a great episode and super helpful. So yeah, thanks for coming by.
Thank you so much. And thanks for all the great work that you both do. It's amazing.
And there you have it, audio heads. Another episode of Launch Your Private Podcast is in the books. I hope you're leaving today feeling even more ready to amplify your voice and connect with your audience in meaningful ways. The adventure continues in our next episode with even more insights, strategies, and inspiration to help you along your own private podcasting journey. Of course, make sure to check out helloaudio.fm to start your own private podcast. And remember, you've got amazing content that needs to be heard. So let's turn the volume up. Until next time.